What kind of man rides past a crying baby on the open prairie and pretends he didn't hear it? Wyatt Harmon froze in his saddle at the sound. The lone wail cut through the hot Dakota wind as if the land itself was begging for help. He had heard wolves, rattlers, and war cries in his years on the frontier, but nothing like this. This cry was thin, desperate, and fading fast. He pushed his hat back and narrowed his eyes at the tall grass. Copper, his buckskin gelding, shifted under him, sensing his tension. There it was again, a weak cry drifting from a dip in the land. No mother's voice, no movement, just the wind and that heartbreaking sound. Wyatt swung down from his saddle and moved quickly through the grass. What he found made his breath catch. A young woman lay on her side, barely breathing, one arm still wrapped around a tiny bundle. The baby's blanket was dirty and thin, and the child's small face was red from crying. A carpet bag lay spilled nearby, clothes scattered, life scattered. Wyatt knelt down fast. The woman was alive. Barely. Her skin burned with fever, and her dress was ripped as if she had fought to keep going until her strength ran out. The baby's cry broke again, weaker this time. "You're hungry, aren't you, little one?" Wyatt murmured. Without thinking twice, he stripped off his coat and wrapped the trembling baby inside it. The child felt far too light in his arms. He had seen cattle near death from hunger, and this little girl's cry held that same hollow sound. He checked the woman again. She was young, too young to be out here alone with a baby. Her hair was a soft brown tangled across her face, and her hand still clutched the blanket as if she had been trying to shield the child, even in her unconscious state. "No wagon, no horse," Wyatt muttered. "What happened to you?" The sun beat down hard. Staying here meant death for both of them. Wyatt lifted the baby with one arm and hoisted the woman onto Copper's back with the other. The horse didn't flinch. Copper had carried cattle, wounded riders, and supplies for years. He stood steady as Wyatt settled the woman across the saddle. "Easy, girl," Wyatt whispered to the baby, tightening the coat around her. "I won't let anything happen to you." He began walking toward Clearwater, leading Copper with one hand while holding the baby against his chest with the other. The heat was merciless, and every mile felt heavier than the last. Several times he stopped to check the baby, each time more worried when the cries faded into whimpers. By the time the town came into view, the sun was sinking low, and Wyatt's legs trembled with exhaustion. Folks stared as he walked down the main road. A cowboy with a limp woman on his horse and a baby in his arms wasn't a sight Clearwater saw every day. He went straight to Doc Harrison's house and kicked at the door. The doctor opened it, took one look, and stepped aside. "Get them in. Now." Inside, Martha Harrison rushed to take the baby. Wyatt hesitated. He'd carried the little one for hours, and giving her up felt wrong. But Martha's kind eyes eased him. "I've raised 5 of my own," she said gently. "Let me help her." Quote, Wyatt handed the baby over, watching as Martha disappeared into the kitchen to warm milk. The doctor worked on the woman, checking her pulse, cooling her fever, muttering to himself. "She's dangerously dehydrated," he finally said, "but alive, and young enough to fight this off." Wyatt let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You did right bringing them," the doctor added. "Not many men would have stopped." Wyatt didn't answer. Stopping had never been a choice. After learning the woman and baby, both still without names, needed days of care, Wyatt arranged a room for them at Mrs. Landry's boarding house. He paid a week up front and hired Molly Jenkins to look after them until the mother regained strength. Mrs. Landry didn't hide her shock. A stranger woman and a baby, left alone on the prairie? What kind of trouble follows them? Quote, "I didn't ask," Wyatt said, his voice harder than he meant. "And it ain't my business. They just need help." Quote, when everything was settled, he returned to the ranch long after dark, his shirt still damp with sweat and his mind filled with the sight of a helpless woman and a baby with sky-blue eyes staring up at him from his coat. He told himself he would check on them in the morning out of simple responsibility, but deep down, he knew the truth. Something about them, about the way he'd found them, had settled into his chest and refused to let go. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. But he knew one thing. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What truth could be so painful that a woman would rather collapse on the open prairie than speak it aloud? Wyatt kept asking himself that question as he rode into Clearwater 3 days later. He had barely slept since finding the woman and baby. Something about them had crawled under his skin, refusing to let go. Mrs. Landry met him at the door with a softer expression than before. "She's awake today?" she whispered. "Weak, but awake. Molly's with her." Wyatt nodded and stepped inside. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. The woman, now washed, braided, and propped up against pillows, looked young, maybe 22. Her skin was pale but no longer gray, and her eyes, they were a clear, startling blue that hit him like a punch. She held the baby in her lap, rocking her gently. The child was fed, calmer, cheeks no longer sunken. Molly stood nearby, smiling as Wyatt stepped in. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mrs. Landry announced. "This is Mr. Wyatt Harmon. He's the man who found you." The woman looked up at him, her expression full of a quiet gratitude that made his throat tighten. I'm told you saved my life," she said softly, "and Emma's." Emma, the baby now had a name, and it fit her perfectly. Wyatt cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. Anybody would have done the same. But her eyes said she didn't believe that. Her hands trembled as she held Emma close. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon, truly." Wyatt stood awkwardly, hat in hand, unsure what else to say. Mrs. Landry ushered Molly out of the room, giving them privacy. The silence stretched. Finally, Wyatt asked, "Do you remember anything before you passed out?" Quote, Lillian Montgomery, he now knew, looked down at her daughter. "Not much. Just trying to keep Emma out of the sun. I remember walking and feeling so tired." She stopped, swallowing hard. Wyatt caught it, the edge of fear behind her voice. "You're safe now," he said gently. "You both are." Her eyes lifted to his, full of something he didn't understand yet. Trust, hope, and maybe something else. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." But she shook her head. "I can't just take and give nothing in return. I'll find work. Anything I can do." Wyatt frowned. "With a baby? That won't be easy." "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "I have to try." There it was again. That fear. A fear of staying, a fear of leaving, a fear of something behind her that might still be coming. He wanted to ask. He didn't. Over the next 2 weeks, Wyatt found himself going into town more and more often. At first to check on them, then to bring supplies, then for no reason he could explain. Emma grew stronger each day, bright blue eyes following him whenever he entered. She loved grabbing his hat, squealing every time he tilted it toward her. Lillian began to smile again, real smiles that lit up her pale face. She moved slowly, still gaining her strength, but she was no longer the ghost he had carried out of the prairie. Wyatt found himself watching her more than he meant to. The gentle way she handled Emma, the soft voice she used when she read aloud, the determination in her expression when she tried walking outside for the first time, gripping his arm for balance. But every time he asked about her past, she shut down. A wall slammed up behind her eyes. Until one afternoon, they sat together on the back porch of the boarding house, Emma dozing in Lillian's arms. A breeze rustled the hanging laundry, carrying the warm scent of soap and summer. "Mrs. Peterson in Riverton offered me a housekeeping job," Lillian said quietly. "She said I can leave with the freight wagon day after tomorrow." Wyatt felt something drop straight through his chest. "You're leaving?" he asked, unable to hide the ache in his voice. "I have to, Wyatt. I can't keep depending on strangers." "You're not a burden." "But I feel like one." He looked at her, really looked, and saw how thin she still was, how carefully she held herself, how her eyes darted toward every passing wagon on the street. "You're scared," he said gently. She froze. "I'm not judging," Wyatt added quickly. I can see it." Lillian stared down at Emma. Her fingers trembled against the baby's blanket. "I was married," she whispered. Wyatt's stomach tightened. "Was?" he repeated softly. She nodded. "To a man named Charles Montgomery, a banker's son back east. My father thought he was wonderful. Her voice was faint, as if she barely had strength to say the words. But after the wedding, he changed. He had a temper. He drank. She stopped, breath catching. He hurt me, Wyatt, often. Wyatt's jaw clenched. When I found out I was pregnant, she continued, I hoped things would change. They got worse. Her hand slid protectively over Emma's small head. I was afraid he'd hurt her too, so I left. I ran with what little money I had. Silence pressed heavy between them. Wyatt finally spoke. Is he looking for you? I don't know. Her voice shook. Maybe. Probably. Wyatt looked out across the dusty street, jaw tight, heart pounding with something fierce. You're not going anywhere, he said quietly. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. Wyatt? Not alone, not scared, not running forever? She shook her head. You've already done too much. I haven't done near enough, he murmured. She stared at him, breath unsteady. Why? She whispered. Wyatt swallowed. Because he liked the way Emma smiled when she saw him. Because he liked the way Lillian's eyes softened when she laughed. Because the thought of them riding away made something twist painfully inside him. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, Let me help. Lillian closed her eyes, and for the first time, tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, but from relief. Thank you, she breathed. And in that quiet moment, Wyatt knew this was no longer kindness. This was something deeper, something dangerous, something he could no longer walk away from. How far will a man go to protect the only two people who ever made him feel like he belonged? Wyatt found out the answer the moment Billy came riding into the far pasture, half falling from his saddle, one eye swollen shut. Wyatt, he's here, Billy gasped. That fancy Eastern fellow Montgomery, he's asking questions at the ranch. He knows Lillian's alive. Wyatt didn't wait to hear more. He was already on his horse. Fear burned through him hotter than the July sun. Not fear for himself, fear for Lillian, fear for Emma. He rode to their little cabin so fast that Copper's hooves barely touched the ground. He saw smoke from the chimney, the laundry on the line, and Lillian outside, shaking a sheet in the breeze. Emma sat on a blanket in the grass, laughing at a butterfly. The sight nearly broke him. He swung out of the saddle, boots hitting the dirt hard. Lillian, he said, voice rough, you have to pack. Right now. Her smile vanished. What happened? Charles is here. Quote. Just saying the name made her knees go weak. No, she whispered, clutching Emma tight. Wyatt, how? Doesn't matter. We're leaving. Inside, she shook as she packed what little they owned, Wyatt throwing rifles, blankets, and food into saddlebags. His hands moved fast, but his mind was locked on one thought. Charles Montgomery would not take them over his dead body. They rode to the line cabin by Eagle Creek, a place hidden deep in the timber where only ranch hands ever went. A safe place. A quiet place. A place where a desperate man could make a stand. For 3 days they waited. The wind whispered through the pines. Emma fussed more than usual, sensing the tension. Lillian barely slept. Wyatt slept even less. Then, early on the 4th morning, the sound of hooves shattered the silence. 2 riders. Wyatt went to the window, jaw clenching. One horse carried Billy, hands tied to the saddle horn. The other carried Charles Montgomery. Lillian gasped softly. No, no, please. Wyatt put his hand on her shoulder. Stay back. Don't come near the door. Quote. Outside, Charles reined in his fine black horse and smiled up at the cabin, the coldest, ugliest smile Wyatt had ever seen. Harmon, he shouted, send out my wife and child, or I'll put a bullet in this boy's head. Billy trembled where he sat, bruised and scared. Wyatt stepped out slowly, gun in hand, eyes locked on Charles. Let the boy go, Wyatt said in a voice far too calm for the rage he felt. Charles pressed his gun harder against Billy's temple. Bring me Lillian and the baby, now. Behind Wyatt, Lillian whispered, I can't let Billy die. Wyatt, please. He's bluffing, Wyatt murmured. Stay inside. But one look at Charles' face told the truth. He wasn't bluffing. He would kill anyone who stood in his way. And that was the mistake that cost him. Billy suddenly threw himself sideways, knocking Charles' arm off aim. The gunshot tore through the quiet morning, but Wyatt was faster. The first bullet hit Charles in the shoulder. The second struck his hand, sending his gun flying. Charles screamed, toppling out of the saddle. Wyatt was on him in a heartbeat, pinning him to the dirt, rage burning through him like wildfire. "You touch my family again," Wyatt growled in his ear, "and I'll bury you so deep the buzzards won't find you." Charles spat blood and fury. "She's my wife. That child is mine." "No," Lillian said suddenly. She stepped out of the cabin, Emma in her arms. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "You lost that, right, the day you raised a hand against me and the day you ignored your own daughter's cries." Emma whimpered softly, sensing the danger. Wyatt tightened his grip on Charles. "We're taking him to Sheriff Davis." Billy, still shaking but alive, nodded. "I'll ride ahead. Tell the sheriff what's coming." By noon, Charles Montgomery was behind bars in Clearwater, screaming about Eastern law and wealthy fathers and judges who owed him favors. Sheriff Davis barely glanced his way. "Territorial law applies here," the sheriff said plainly. "Threatening a woman, kidnapping a ranch hand, and attempting murder, that's enough to keep him locked up a long while." Quote, the door slammed shut on Charles. Fury. Lillian burst into quiet tears of relief. Wyatt held her close, Emma tucked safely between them. "He can't hurt you now," Wyatt promised. "Either of you." She leaned into him. "Wyatt, I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," he said, pressing his forehead to hers. "You trusted me." The next morning, Sheriff Davis took both their statements. The charges were official. Charles Montgomery was going nowhere except prison bars. Wyatt rented a hotel room for the night, the first soft bed they'd shared since their marriage. And for the first time in weeks, Lillian slept without fear. That evening, as Emma played with the buttons on Wyatt's shirt, Lillian took his hand. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Wyatt looked at her with a courage he hadn't known he possessed. "We build a life," he said. "A real one, a safe one, together." Her eyes filled with tears. "A home?" she whispered. He nodded. "Our own place. Land. A ranch Emma can grow up on. A school you can run. A future Charles will never touch again." Quote. Lillian covered her mouth, overcome. "Oh, Wyatt, yes, yes." He kissed her then, fully, deeply, the kiss of a man who had fought for his family and won them. 3 months later, they bought a small ranch near Willow Creek. A warm house, strong fences, good water, a place that felt like a beginning. Emma took her first steps on that land. Lillian opened a tiny schoolhouse for the nearby ranch children. And Wyatt? He woke every morning to the sound of his wife's soft breathing and his daughter's laughter drifting through the house. One warm June evening, Lillian placed Wyatt's hand gently on her stomach. "We're going to have another baby," she whispered. Wyatt pulled her close, joy filling every corner of his heart. "Looks like Emma's gettin' a little brother or sister," he murmured. Emma climbed into his lap, saying her favorite word, "Dada." Lillian smiled. She knew from the very beginning. Wyatt looked at the two people who had changed everything, his wife, his daughter, his family. All because he heard a hungry child crying in the grass. And stopped.